Well, hello there. And welcome. Welcome to a special edition of 5 Minutes with Robert and Amy Nasir. A special edition this early Friday or in the afternoon if you're joining us on the other side of the globe.
It's 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time
But
this
what
morning.
time is it in Athens? We are joined by a very special guest. Folks, this is going to be good. We've got an interview this morning, a conversation with the man who knows more about history than you'll ever forget, Scott Powell. Scott, how are you doing on this fine Friday afternoon in Athens, is it?
It is indeed, yes, and surprisingly not that great weather-wise, but usually it is. So, yes, can't complain too much.
Whatever the weather, I know a lot of us are jealous of where you are. Scott Powell, for folks who don't know, Scott Powell is a historian. Is it a historian or an historian? The perpetual debate. Our folks in the UK will give us grief over that. An historian and teacher who has been teaching homeschool students online for nearly 20 years. The author of 3 books, including The 4-Hour Historian, The History of Now, and the upcoming The History of Tomorrow.
Wow.
His present-centric approach was developed from the conviction that history is an essential subject that is vital for anyone who wants to live a fully engaged life and make sense of the world they live in. Scott, that sounds like an ambitious project. And right away, I've got to ask you, what is present-centric? I don't want to just leave that out there. I want to get into your history of history, but what is present-centric? Can you get us started with that?
Yeah, absolutely, right. So clearly, the conventional notion of history is that it is the study of the past. And present-centrism says, hold on, that is not going to be nearly as helpful as we might hope it would be. And in fact, in my long experience, both as a student and as a teacher, that subject has failed to deliver. And so it took me a while to, penetrate through to why that is. But ultimately, I came to the realization that in fundamental terms, the study of the past doesn't connect properly with life as we experience it. Children especially, see it as irrelevant and consequently boring. And it's not a subject that has successfully captured people's imagination and desire to continue, and we don't live consequently in a historically minded culture. And working through that problem as a teacher, I came to the conclusion that there needed to be what I would describe as a modal shift, meaning that the idea of the study of the past as disconnected from life in the present is an irresolvable problem, and that in fact you have to completely change your perspective on what history is in order to get it right. That took me a long time. And The History of Now, which is the book that I would recommend people to try out if they're just hearing about this approach, is something that's been around for 5-6 years now. It's still very much an introductory work, so it doesn't necessarily answer all the questions that might arise in your mind about present-centrism. But what it does do is it does give you an example of this approach. So you asked, what is present-centrism? Well, the approach is this. Present-centrism is a mode of historical inquiry that seeks to provide an integrated historical awareness of the world we live in. So you can see that the emphasis there, the shift in focus, is that the object of study is not the past, the thing which no longer exists, but rather the world that we live in. And of course, the world came to be somehow. There was a process. There is a history. That is the story that helps us to understand why things are the way they are. So that's the approach that I take.
See, that's interesting to me, because I think in academics, there are fields like mathematics. On the engineering level, we think math, arithmetic, some level of calculus, but higher mathematics, mathematicians like to think that their subject is completely disconnected from physical reality. They talk about higher math as, well, in completely Platonic terms. And it's interesting that, well, we've kind of done that with history. It's very interesting, but it's kind of disconnected from day-to-day life. Maybe gives us an idea how we got where we are, but what does it really have to do with living? And it sounds like you have done for history what some of the better mathematicians, or even some theorists, even people like Harry Binswanger, who are trying to say, no, none of this is disconnected from reality. If you're doing it in that way, you're missing out on something. It sounds like you're doing that for history, very grounded. Did you start in history, or did you have a background that brought you to this approach?
Well, I'd definitely like to share that story, but
yes.
I particularly appreciate the comparison that you made there, because I would describe modern historiography, at least the serious kind, because we have to differentiate, because we live in a very unserious culture nowadays. Largely speaking, when we are talking about history now, what we're really talking about is something very subjective. In other words, it's your version, my version. Is it gender-based? Is it based on your race or your nationality or what have you? And the premise is that there really isn't such a thing as an objective version of history at all. But the serious historians out there, I would say, you are correct, or at least your statement concerning Platonism in mathematics is absolutely applicable to history as well. The historians have the view, the serious ones, as I say, have the view that the study of history is a kind of contemplative act. It is much more akin to art appreciation or literature. So what you're doing is you're learning a story which is really to be enjoyed for its own sake. And so if you can't embrace that, right, if you're learning about a Holy Roman Emperor in Austria 500 years ago, or if you're learning about some sort of Egyptian pharaoh that lived 4,000 years ago, and you're asking yourself the question, well, what does this have to do with real life? Well, the Platonist-minded historian would say to you, well, that's not even a valid question. You're supposed to essentially reprogram yourself and adopt the view that this is an end in itself, that the study of the past is akin to higher math, if you will, or philosophy, of course, Platonism, where basically we are simply exposing ourselves to something that is inherently fascinating, intrinsically valuable. And if you can't grasp that, then the academic historian of today thinks that that's really plain and simple, because you are one of those people that is looking at the shadows on the wall. And you haven't figured out how to exit the cave and get to the higher truth that is the intrinsic value of the past.
Yeah, I think another great example of this would be, for those who have read Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, we have the character of Robert Stadler, who considers, he runs the State Science Institute, and it, should be, theoretical science and, not applied to technology. That's plebeian. That's beyond. It's that's too low of a purpose. The higher purpose in life is to have that kind of Platonic approach to knowledge that you're just talking about. So yeah, that runs its course in a lot of ways.
Contemplation for its own sake.
Yes.
Yeah. Now there's maybe one step better than that. Is your average person who says, well, I like history because it inspires me. It gives me ideas. I watched the 300. I watched Napoleon. I want to be more like that. I want to live a larger life. But that's really what we get also from fiction. And it's great if we get that from history. But is it telling us anything about, well, yeah, but where are we? Where is our world?
Right.
How did we get here?
I think of that also in the category of historical reenactors, whom I know many of historical reenactors. And I myself used to be a costume presenter at Greenfield Village at the Henry Ford, and so I can totally relate to the idea of immersing yourself into the concretes of daily life of, say, 1875, and so forth. So, yeah.
But looking at what you do with history at our house and with Scott Powell history in general, that's barely scratching the surface.
Yeah, I mean, I of course I have no objection to anybody drawing inspiration from history. I personally am very inspired,
Yeah.
of course, by the people that actually did live in the past that did certain things. I would, of course, name Herodotus of ancient Greece as a personal hero of mine, along with various philosophers like Socrates and Aristotle. I personally am very inspired by the founding fathers, of course, of the United States and how they acted on a level that is quite on par, in fact, with what you might experience, from literature. And the same goes for the great inventors of the Industrial Revolution and others in history. So there's plenty of inspiration to be had, that's for sure. And there's more as well. And one of the common views of history is that we have to learn from the past in order to not repeat the mistakes of the past and so on. That's sort of what I would call instruction, gaining instruction from the past. And when that's done well, it certainly does deliver. The problem that has arisen is that people now, in this very subjective culture of ours, have an basically insuperable method of sidestepping any truth that you might try to deploy by means of historical example. And that would be that, oh, you're just cherry picking. You are, you've chosen this particular aspect of history. And if you had looked at it differently, then you would come up with an opposite conclusion. Like you might say, for instance, with the founding fathers, you're saying, well, you're only talking about the pursuit of happiness and the rights of the individual, but you're not talking about the fact that the founders owned slaves, right? And so we can instantly, effectively, negate any type of argument from the past by simply picking a counter argument, sometimes having to do with the very same person, or sometimes having to do with something that was contemporary to them, or something to that effect, right? So it's, I don't have a problem with using historical examples for polemical purposes, let's say, or simply for demonstrable purposes, when it comes to for your own sake, learning about general truths, and certainly in alliance with philosophy, that's where you're going to get the most bang for your buck there. But in our culture, that reliance on that model, which I would refer to as kind of the inspirational and instructional model of history, which is quite the classical model, that has failed. I can't put it any other way than to say that it has failed. It has come under assault from that intellectual clique within academia that is focused on subjectivism. And unfortunately, the subjectivists are pretty clever when they want to attack things that are worth upholding. But the more classical thinkers don't tend to have the defenses properly built up to back up what they're trying to do.
Right.
So my approach is really neither. It's not classical, it's not modern social studies either. Present-centrism is seeking to do something, I think, more fundamental, in which, if it succeeds, will permit us to get back to a place where we will be able to draw all of the lessons out of history and succeed, and where we'll have the strongest position to operate from. And so the goal here, if I had to put it in a word, is insight. And the point here is that what we're trying to do is understand the world we live in, how it came to be this way, which is actually quite a difficult proposition. But once you see it, and readers of the history of now can basically get to a framework that does that delivers on that promise.
Good. So it sounds like you have some patience towards people who will, not necessarily the more nefarious types who will say, well, Thomas Jefferson, he owned slaves, so therefore let's not even delve into or get insight from his writings or his actions or his accomplishments. Let's not get inspiration or knowledge even from his life, and the context of the founding fathers and all of this. So how would you? I mean, for that particular example, how would you handle that, or has that ever come up in your class?
Oh my goodness! Of course, it comes
Yeah.
up inevitably.
Yeah.
And what I would say about the founders in particular, of course, is that they are responsible for creating the country that is the United States. Now, in the present-centric approach, the key is we want to understand the world we live in. Well, it's an America-centric world, whether you like it or not, and for better and for worse. And so if you want to understand how did this America-centric world arise, well, actually, 1776 is what I call a cardinal anchor fact of an integrated awareness of world history. You need that fact. You don't have to like it. You don't have to like 1492 either. There's a lot of stuff in the past that you might object to, whether you're right or wrong. I personally don't have, that issue when it comes to either the explorers of the Age of Discovery or the founding fathers of the United States. Certainly, they were flawed human beings, but they were the best that culture had to offer at the time. And what they did fundamentally was advance their culture and humanity overall, regardless of what flaws they did embody. And the thing is, with the founding fathers, to stick with that example, right? The Declaration of Independence, followed by the Revolutionary War, followed by the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, those things impelled into being the United States of America, which ultimately became, by far, the greatest country in the history of the world. So you cannot ignore that reality when you're trying to make sense of the world. You might object, and believe you me, when I work with my kids in the History at Our House program, when I talk with adults, we get into some pretty delicate issues. I am not a fan, for instance, of America's conduct as the world police power. I am certainly not a fan of the United States acting the way that it is with regard to, say, the Russia-Ukraine war. And so there are disagreements to be had over these difficult topics in the present. But to set the context properly and understand how we got here, that I consider is my main job. And so in the history of now, for instance, you'll get America as a politically separate country dedicated to individual rights. Then you'll see the transition to America becoming the world police power and entangled in the politics of other cultures. And you'll get the proper context for understanding, this is how America became so invested, for instance, in the relationship between Europe and Russia. That was not the case. One of the anchor facts of American history that goes along with the Declaration of Independence is the Monroe Doctrine. James Monroe basically said, we are going to maintain this separation because our political systems are fundamentally incompatible. Now, that eventually was let go of, right, primarily by Woodrow Wilson because of America's entry into World War I. There are other contributors, right? But eventually you get to a point where America's completely entangled in the politics of other people. That has not been to America's benefit. It's created a hybridization of cultural values by virtue of the interconnection. And it's been unfortunately causing America's culture to degrade.
Yeah.
And well, not to get into too polemical of a topic, but if America gets into a world war in order to decide the fate of Ukraine, which is fundamentally a civil war between two different Slavic peoples that have been united for 2,000 years, that would be a catastrophic outcome. So anyway,
so what I'm hearing from you is that just regardless of your opinions or dislike or repulsion of historical facts of what happened and how people used to treat each other, for instance, or how people are treating each other today, that shouldn't invalidate your effort into trying to understand the world around you. I think that's kind of what I'm getting from you, and so So, Robert, do you have any follow-up questions?
No, I think
Yeah.
one of the great examples of that, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but if folks are thinking, oh, yeah, rah, rah, U.S. Well, yeah, rah, rah, U.S., but the point isn't just the U.S. was the greatest cultural accomplishment in history, but that the U.S. has had the most massive impact since its founding. And you're not prejudiced in the sense of you're going to cover the U.S. because you like the U.S. Of the 5 cultural blocks that you outline, Russia is one of those, and it's not that, oh, we're the biggest fans of Russia or we're the biggest enemies of Russia, but no, just objectively, Russia and China and the Middle East and Europe as a whole, they are historical, well, as you call them, blocks, cultural blocks. So, yeah, it's very tempting as an American to say, yeah, the United States, let's focus on that because of the great things we did. Well, yeah, let's do that, but not because we're great and that's what we want to think about. That gets us more to that, well, we want the inspiration or we want the stories, we want the fictional. No, let's look at where we're at, how did we get here, and what else is going on out there. I shouldn't even say what else is going on out there. What is going on out there? Now, let me, since we're talking about history, let me ask you, Scott, about your history. How did you get here? How did it come to be that that you are essentially the man who is revolutionizing history, at least for your students and ideally for the rest of the world as well? How did we get here? How did you get here?
Thank you. Yeah, so I think that when I look back on my life experience and how I came to be where I am, when I was a student, in private school, history was of no interest to me whatsoever. I graduated and went on to engineering, and so I was partway through my engineering degree when I started to mature to the point where I realized, oh, this is not something that it can be done in isolation. There were a variety of experiences that I had as a young person that led me to realize, oh my goodness, there is an interface between engineering and the rest of society, and there's a need to have a better understanding of the wider world. And so I started to contend with those issues as a young adult. And then I was fortunate enough at that point, it took me a while, I meandered around the subject of philosophy a little bit and found my way ultimately to Ayn Rand, and I enjoyed reading her fiction very much. That was really the crucial moment where I found that the kind of clarity that I desperately, and of course so many young people desperately need when it comes to the really big questions in life. And once I encountered that, I had a whole bunch of other unanswered questions, including, where does this fit? Like, how come the world around me doesn't already embody all of these values? This is clearly the truth. This is a way better set of answers than I've ever heard from anybody. How can it be that people would allow themselves to ignore this or to, I had to find that out. So I became interested in the history of philosophy in particular, because the first thing I wanted to do was find out, well, okay, who else is out there? Are there any other comparable thinkers? What are the arguments? What does this subject consist of in historical context? Because evidently Ayn Rand's a modern thinker in the sense of a 20th century thinker. So I was wondering, okay, where does that fit in history? There are some clues to that evidently in that list, but it wasn't obvious. And then the question that came up from my studies of the history of philosophy, some of which I did in university, it really started to become clear to me that there's another question, which is, well, okay, how does philosophy actually impact the world? Because here we have this, to my mind, genius, Ayn Rand, who enunciated truths in a way that's never been done before, and yet the culture at large does not seem to embrace those ideas or values. So what's up? What is what's the issue there? And so it led me to the study of history in general, and so that's my own personal journey. Now, as far as and studying history in college was a severe letdown. It was it's that academic type of work, but not only that, it was the subjectivism was seeping into academia already. I mean, this is over 20 years ago, but nonetheless, the subjectivism was very heavily seeping in. I was not allowed, for instance, to create an individual study program because there wasn't a class on the founding fathers. So I said, I want to make my own. I wasn't allowed to do that. I had to make a class on the founding fathers and mothers. And so that was that allowed me to read up on Abigail Adams and an interesting woman historian by the name of Mercy Otis Warren. But truly, that's an inflationary characterization of their role, evidently, to call them founding mothers. These are really interesting women, but it's true that the culture of the time was obviously a male-dominated culture, and there really only are founding fathers. So as much as I benefited from that, it was just one example of the challenges that I was really realizing, wow, academic history is not for me. And so I ended up in a teaching job. I was fortunate to get a teaching job at a school in Southern California that many of your listeners would be familiar with, which is Van Damme Academy. And so after a few years of teaching there, I was contending with this challenge in my own mind. What am I delivering to these kids? And is it really paying off? What kind of values am I creating? What am I contributing to their intellectual lives? And actually, I'm going to back up just a little bit because there are two threads that need to converge. When I was in college, 9/11 happened. And it was really, looking back, it was perhaps the one moment that really drove home for me what is everything that's wrong with history today. Because I was on campus and all the students were huddled around the various big screen TVs in the student lounges and watching the events unfold. And then I went off to a history class. And the students were all abuzz. They were all completely drawn in by these events that were occurring, and they wanted the professors, of course, these erudite, knowledgeable, wise people that are to be imparting their wisdom to us, right? They were hoping to get some insight into there's that key word, insight. Yeah. They wanted some insight into how did this come about? Why are we now in this crisis? The likes of which we've never experienced before. And well, the professor in that particular class wanted to tell us about the intricacies of the terror, which was the French Revolution. So he had nothing to say about the war on terror. He had nothing to say about Islamism or the confluence of factors that had brought about the events that were unfolding in the world around us. He wanted to tell us about France of 1793, and that's all he knew. And so that was really disappointing to me because it was like, well, what's the point of knowing about what the French were doing to each other in 1793 if we can't figure out what we're doing right here and now and navigate through this world of ours and get some insight into how things are working. So that really was a troubling time for me because it really drove home that academic history has nothing to say about real life. Right. And then in my own personal life, as a follow-up to that, the next event that really shook me was the great financial crisis of 2007, 2008, because as a historian, I was just starting to get my mind wrapped around this idea that I want to better understand the world of today. And then this next one hits me right away, and it's, wow, we almost experienced an economic crash of the scale of the Great Depression. Yeah. And arguably, I'm not an economist, but arguably, we are going through a long drawn out something or other, Great Recession / whatever you want to call it, with the Federal Reserve creating untold amounts of money and the government running trillion+ deficits and whatnot in order to mask everything that's going on in the economy. And so, okay, but regardless of how that's working out, because that certainly is not my area of expertise. Again, it was another example of really important things are happening, and I don't understand why. And history is not helping me. And so it just became, my mission, effectively, to make that connection. If I'm going to study the past, it's got to be useful. It's got to help me to navigate through the world that I live in. And I want to do that for my kids as well. I want them to understand that if they're learning about these important stories that there is a payoff, and what that is.
Yes. That's great. So I mean, so you studied the history of philosophy, and I mean, in terms of Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism, Robert and I find it very applicable to our lives in understanding the world. And so I'm, how much does objectivism play into your presentation, your approach to history?
Well, I could barely even scratch the surface on that topic in an interview like this, but most fundamentally, which is going to really play out much more obviously in the history of tomorrow. The biggest factor of all is Ayn Rand's theory of concepts and of epistemology. That's a very unappreciated feature of her philosophy. Most people are focused on ethics and politics, which is kind of understandable. But as an intellectual who's really striving to integrate a vast plethora of information, what Ayn Rand had to say about concepts and of the need to perform unit reduction in that area really has been a huge help in terms of understanding what needs to be done in order to foster integrated historical cognition. Like I said, that's a theme that's mainly going to play out in the history of tomorrow, where I explain what I hope is going to be a significant contribution in the field of epistemology as well as in history, because I think I've hit upon something that really is very significant there.
Now, you said the history of tomorrow in our chat. Greg Lewis is saying, I thought history of tomorrow was just a play on your title, The History of Now. What can you tell us about the history of tomorrow?
Yeah, well, happily, I'll indicate a few things. The history of tomorrow, the history of now, as the title kind of implies, is all about gaining insight into the world of today. If I had to, on one foot describe the history of tomorrow, it's about gaining foresight. It's about extending the power of history to the point where it becomes a viable predictive framework for the cultures that we live in as they unfold in an interconnected network as they are today. So my goal in the history of tomorrow is to describe the next incarnation of American culture that we are currently experiencing a transition towards, in my view. And if you see in the history of now, what you'll see is I periodize the history of the United States, which is to say, I organize it into two fundamental periods. In foreign policy, that's political separation and world police power. In terms of the social contract in the history of tomorrow, I refer to early America as the Republic, which the founding fathers referred to it as, right? And modern America as embodying a social contract of democracy, which is not the same thing. Clearly, the founding fathers were not keen on the idea of democracy, but when does a presidential candidate refer to the American Republic ever anymore? Right? It's all about our democracy, our democracy, our democracy. And so we've already made that transition. But in fact, I would argue that we are also now experiencing yet another transition where basically the United States is adopting what is going to be a very strange looking form of socialism.
Yeah.
So, clearly, if you're just looking at the idea of the right to health care, if you're looking at the presence of Social Security, environmental regulation, housing, just about every aspect of the economy has quite a powerful government presence there. And so we are definitely moving into a phase of American history where socialism is going to be the dominant idea. But America being what it is, that's going to look kind of strange. Because how do you get there in an America that has the Bill of Rights? How do you get there in an America that has the Constitution with its checks and balances and all of these other devices that were embedded for the purpose of defending natural rights? You're going to get there in a pretty messy way, and you're going to end up, in fact, with a strangely incoherent and composite culture, which is very difficult to characterize. I think we can all feel it. We can all feel that the coherency and cohesiveness of American culture is rather, it's becoming increasingly fragmented, right, and segmented. And we even have people talking about things like the national divorce or a new civil war of that sort. And so those are all symptoms of this changing culture. So that's what the History of Tomorrow is about, is trying to show what can history tell us about that? By what means, by what tools can we develop the model that is laid out in the History of Now? How can that be elaborated upon and developed into a predictive framework? So that's what's coming. You were going to ask me when that's going to be available. I know, and so I'll just go ahead and say it. I think I'm shooting for April or May.
Of this year.
Of this year?
It's really got to be this year.
Okay. Yes, that's right.
The tricky thing about present-centric historiography is the world is changing as we speak. Now, if you go and read the History of Now and you see my characterization of the various cultural blocks, I'm happy to report, I guess I'm happy to report, that basically those characterizations are still valid. So in other words, we're still in that now. The one that I wrote about, say, about 5-6 years ago. However, I do think that we are rapidly transitioning into that next phase of history. And of course, in order for us to get there, we have to go through certain things that happen. They're triggers for historical change. And so, the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, for instance, is definitely a major trigger. We have the Russia-Ukraine war, which started in 2022, is definitely a signaling event. And the COVID pandemic and everything that happened there was definitely a major event. And so there are a variety of those that have happened since I wrote the History of Now, which I have to find a way to incorporate, of course. Otherwise, what's the value of the predictive framework if it doesn't account for the things that are going on now?
Now, quick question. This wasn't something that we talked about beforehand, so you don't have to give. You can think about this for later. But I'm just curious. Speaking of predictive models, I think of Leonard Peikoff's dim hypothesis, and if there was any shaping of your thoughts from his ideas, his theories. I'm just curious. But if you haven't, give it some thought if you haven't,
There's one fundamental impulse there, and that is that I would characterize present-centrism as the only truly integrated historiographical mode. So if you're interested in the idea of integration or misintegration or disintegration and how that might map out as an epistemological mode, that's exactly, I describe present-centrism as a mode, precisely for that reason. It is a mode of historical cognition. And so it is the aim is to provide a fully integrated awareness of the world we live in. Nothing short of the whole thing. Yes, there's definitely a major line of influence there. There's definitely.
Yeah, I mean that kind of the present centric. I know it's sometimes it has brought to mind the idea of we need to just kind of wallow in the weeds of today and the news cycle or something like that. And I understand it's not that. It is not that. So my understanding of, as you're talking more and more, I'm starting to integrate. It sounds like present-centric basically means self-centric in terms of using your reason to understand the world, and perhaps even using induction to applying the concept of induction, as we talk about it in objectivism, to history and to to understanding our world in that way. Is that a fair idea?
Well, here's how I would put it. I mean, if you look at the opening of the History of Now, you'll see that the very first page says "You are here." Right? So that's always the emphasis. The point is that historical knowledge is in order to empower us as we live our lives. So, of course, everybody's use of history is going to be unique to them as an individual. There's nothing wrong with that, of course. And so, yeah, I mean, and if we tie that to epistemology as well, it's really important that historical cognition is an active process of inquiry that you must enact just as much as you have to do everything. You have to will yourself to clearly think through any issue. So yeah, there's definitely those aspects are definitely present in how you should approach it.
Yeah, you point out that conventional history, I'm sure when you were studying history and you get that combination of memorize all of these dates and all of these events, and also slap on top of that our current cultural, I don't even know what the right word is to use to describe the way in which we slap history around with the cause of the day. But you say history should have integration and hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
What does that look like compared to what's, and I know this is kind of jumping back to a simple question of what does that look like compared to what we see in the grade schools, what you may see public schools students who you might be meeting coming in, or what you saw in college in studying history?
Yeah, so things are changing for the worse, definitely in that regard. I get reports from clients that have their kids, that want to go back to public school. They want to socialize more. They have various reasons for perhaps departing and then returning to the program. And I have one in particular that did just that, went to public school at the beginning of this academic year, and within a few months was already so upset at what was passing for history that basically he told his mom, I don't want to go to public school anymore. So
Now the flip.
Now why is that? Well,
yeah.
It's actually it's not what, it's not that dry version of history that says, here, memorize these 1,000 facts and regurgitate them on a multiple choice test. No, it's more, for younger kids, but nonetheless, what they're doing is they're very randomly picking topics. It's the social studies method, really, which is just kind of a random grab bag of things. It's whatever the kids can kind of come up with, and whatever topics occur to them to ask questions about. Very student driven. The teachers don't even seem to know history themselves, so they don't really have any lecturing to do. They don't have any knowledge to impart. They're there to collaborate in some sort of, hand-holding exercise, collective group, discussion of things that they don't really know anything about. So that's unfortunately that's where things have gone. It's gotten that bad.
Now the flip side of that, in an earlier conversation, you had an interesting answer. I had asked you, well, do you run into any conflicts with Christian students or their parents? And you had an interesting answer to that one, especially for kids coming out of Catholic schools.
Yeah, so I strive to, in homeschooling parlance, there are a variety of approaches to education. And there is what's called inclusive homeschooling, and there is what is called secular homeschooling, which tends to be a little bit more combative and anti-Christian. But what I try to do is both. I try to, of course, I advocate a secular, in other words, non-religious interpretation of history. But I think present-centrism is as inclusive as it gets, because we're all living in the same world, and that's not a choice, and we all want to understand it. And so as long as that's your motive, right, as long as you're not coming to history with the expectation that you're going to be proving some predisposition that you already have or prejudice that you are inclined to have believed because somebody told you that, your parents or whoever, right? Okay, if you're coming at it to understand the world, then whatever your religious background is, History at Our House is for you, because basically, if you're a Catholic, you don't have to worry about a Protestant spin on the meaning of the Reformation. If you are a Muslim, you don't have to worry about a Christian spin on the Crusades. If you are a Buddhist, you don't have to worry about a European spin on the history of India, what have you, right? I mean, it's simply a story. It's an encounter. And yeah, I never shy away from the conflicts and the violence of history. It's there. There's no way to pretend that it's not. And so, yeah, but again, the focus is always, how did we get here? And, for better or for worse. And actually mostly for the better, right? We live in a great time.
Yes.
I tell my kids. I tell my
We
kids.
talk about this all the time. We live in a great time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's maybe not as good as pre-2019. Okay, but it's at the very, very top.
Yes.
It's at the very, very top.
It's
So
simultaneously the most ominous and the most wonderful of times.
Yes.
yeah,
It's-
I really find the more history unfolds around me, the more appreciation I have for that opening line of A Tale of Two Cities. I feel like that was genius. That is one of
Yes.
the greatest all-time opening lines, because we do live in the best of times.
Yes.
And to a considerable extent, we live in the worst of times as well.
Yes.
So, really quite.
And Scott, you would know, let me jump to a purely personal note. Where are you at this morning? Where are we talking to you from?
Right. Well, I and my family have adopted a kind of semi-nomadic lifestyle. So currently we are moving around the Mediterranean, and I'm in Athens. So that, of course, as a historian, provides me with an opportunity to walk, in the Parthenon and the Acropolis on a nearly daily basis. So it's quite inspiring. So yeah.
Well, that's why I appreciate your perspective on the best and worst of times, because so many of us think simply they're the worst of times, that we, to steal from the Chinese curse, live in interesting times, knowing that somebody like yourself, with your understanding of history, and therefore your understanding of our current cultural situation, our epoch, and that combination of having that level of worldliness, I really appreciate that you have the degree of optimism, or at least cheer, about our present situation, and you understand these are wonderful times we live in, and also potentially catastrophic ones. That means a lot to me, and for what we do on this show, because we tend to be the optimists in the room.
Yes. And Greg, so Greg on YouTube, he has a question. He says, isn't the objective to create, I guess the objective of history, to create a tool that can be used in the river's current to anticipate and potentially course correct?
That's an interesting characterization. I like it. It reminds me of Heraclitus, and
Yes.
the idea that you can't step in the same river twice. And certainly, if you characterize history as a river, there's truth to that. I think that I'm actually more of a fan of Heraclitus than many of my peers and friends, and so I like that. But yes, I would say that we haven't yet. I think the point is, if we gain the power that history potentially can give us, I say potentially because it's very early days, and present-centrism hasn't developed yet, and there's a lot. It's still very early, but I think if we have that power, and looking back on history, I would say that the two cultures that were most historically minded, actually there's three cultures in history that were most historically minded, are the three greatest flourishings in human history. That is not an accident. What do I mean? Ancient Greece. The people that invented history were the people that built the Parthenon, were the people that defeated the Persians, were the people that created art, philosophy, and natural science and literature. I mean, that was really an unparalleled flourishing. History was there. It was a part of it. Then the second of the major cultural flourishings in human history is referred to as the Renaissance. And the Renaissance was very much a very consciously historical phenomenon. In fact, the term Renaissance, which is French, means rebirth. What were they thinking? They were thinking, well, we are bringing back Greco-Roman culture, right? We know that we lost sight of that. It was submerged for a long time. And what we're doing is we're bringing that back. And with that renewed historical sense came the scientific revolution, came so many different transformations down the line. So that would be the second of the great historical flourishings. And then the third was the Founding Fathers and the birth of the United States. The Founding Fathers were incredibly knowledgeable about history. They studied ancient Rome and Greece. They knew that like the back of their hand. And so when they designed the United States, they knew what they were doing. They built it more on a Roman model, but using a lot of what they understood of Greek philosophy and of Greek history, and they combined those to create something which is really unparalleled. And so when you have the power of history, see what you get from it, right? You really, and those are the three episodes that are more indicative than any other. So if we can bring it back, then I think we can be empowered to an altogether new degree. So that's what, that's the hope that drives me, certainly.
Yeah, that's a very optimistic perspective, more so than I read Greg's comment, because when I think of the river metaphor, I think of, well, we want to course correct well before we get to the waterfall. And sometimes it feels like, no, we're kind of close. I'm not sure we can avoid it.
Now, look, I can't speak to whether or not we're going to make, the right corrections or how quickly or how significantly we're going to be able to do anything at this time. My view, part of what makes you a historian is the long view. So I'm very much invested in making a lasting contribution. And if things don't turn out in the short term, well, okay, that can happen.
Well, now speaking of living a nomadic life, I certainly want to understand a little bit more how you do that. Maybe offline, but that sounds like a bit of fun, actually. So.
Well, and it's inspiring because, again, especially in the Ayn Rand fan community and the objectivist community, some of us don't pick up and unroot and move out. And Yaron Brook always says, for example, well, if you don't like your life, if you don't like where you're living, just move. And some of us with more family ties think, well, that would be kind of hard. So it's always inspiring to talk to somebody who's actually said, no, you can do this. And you've got the internet, you've got ways to stay in touch with people, and if you've got some degree of prosperity, you can go back and forth and you can visit. And so I do appreciate that. Now, as we get near the top of the hour, the new course begins tomorrow. Now, a lot of folks will already be familiar with History at Our House, the K through 2 programs. But Knowable World is now coming out, and you've got programs for the entire span of grades, grade school?
Right. So History at Our House currently is a program that's basically for third graders through 12th grade. So
that's 3 through 12.
From elementary to high school graduation. And then Knowable World is the new project that my partner Heather Schwartz and I are working on. And that's designed to basically provide an on-ramp, because we found that students at the third grade level are not ready. And this is something that I've experienced a lot, as far as the older the kids get, the later they come to History at Our House, the more issues they have, the more effectively baggage, more damage has been done by the educational establishment. So I would love to be able to provide homeschoolers with the tools to help their kids from the very moment they start asking questions about the world we live in. So we have what's called the History Detectives program, which is part of Knowable World, and that literally can be implemented from kindergarten, it's exactly designed for that level. And for kids that aren't quite ready yet, of course, it could be done in first or second grade. But regardless of exactly, it's not so much a grade level issue as it is a student's level of intellectual development that they're ready for. And as soon as they are ready, It's really the kind of program that will start to lead them properly to reward them for the natural curiosity that they have about the world, and lead them in the right direction towards a wider awareness and ultimately an integrated historical awareness. That, of course, comes much later, and it takes time. That's provided by the History at Our House program. So now for your adults who, of course, have missed out on this, what do we do, right? How do we backfill? How do we renovate our own awareness of the past? Well, there's no doubt in my mind that the History of Now is the best place to start. And if you want to read that on your own, well, please do. But in addition, I'm going to be giving a seminar series here starting tomorrow, March 2nd. And that will be a guided tour. It will be the ultimate way to get a very essentialized presentation and guidance on how to assimilate that material for adult students. And a lot of the insight that I have achieved through writing the History of Tomorrow is going to be brought to bear. So you're going to get kind of a little bit of extra material there, because I'm happy to report that in writing the History of Tomorrow, the History of Now has proven itself to be extremely powerful foundation. And I myself enjoy the benefits of understanding it and have come to understand it better on my own. And I'm going to impart that to the students. So very happy to be able to provide that. Basically, if anybody wants to find out about it, the link is at Knowable World, which generally is for kids, but basically that's where we found a spot to put the adult course as well for the time being. So
outstanding.
That's to direct people.
And folks, in the YouTube description, you will find the link right at the top of the description to that adult course, as well as the Knowable World website in general, so you can get information both for yourselves and the kids. Now, that course starts tomorrow, and some folks will be listening to this as a podcast a few days later and think, oh, I missed it. But as you mentioned to me earlier, you are recording these sessions, so somebody could sign up even if they missed tomorrow morning's start and catch up and then join into the live sessions as they go. Is that right?
Yeah, you could do it that way. You could certainly, if somebody were to reach out to me tomorrow, I could probably get you in right away. If somebody reaches out to me in the weeks to come, I could very easily set you up with the recordings. I always maintain a recorded archive of courses I've given in the past, and so basically you could watch the entire thing via recordings. And if you are a live client, you not only will get the recordings and be able to keep the recordings, but you will also have the opportunity to ask questions and be challenged by me as your teacher. So there's that added benefit. So yeah, I would definitely say if you can, sneak in right now here at the last minute. And if you can't, well then, you'll definitely at least be able to have the recordings.
Yeah, and if you want to reach out and get Scott's book, The History of Now, it's on Amazon. And I actually found it very intriguing to read the reviews of Scott Powell's book. Amish Adalja, who we've actually interviewed before, the great Amish Adalja, he actually leaves a really nice review. You should check out. And but yeah, it's very good. Just go to Amazon, Scott Powell, The History of Now.
Yeah, and there's a direct link to that in the show description as well.
Yep.
Outstanding. Well, Scott, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about what you've done, and what you're doing, and what is starting tomorrow on March 2nd. Folks, look at those links, look up those resources, take advantage of this opportunity. Yeah,
and if you like what we do here on 5 Minutes with Robert and Amy Nasir, please go ahead and like and share our interviews here, our regular shows on Sundays at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we've got Patreon and PayPal and all of that stuff if you've got a little extra money to spare. So we appreciate it.
And Scott, any last words before we wrap up?
Any last words? Well, thank you very much for having me. It was a very enjoyable conversation, and I hope it's given people an opportunity to ponder the possibility that history can be more than what they have probably experienced in their lives. And I'll be very happy to help if they want to see if they can restore that, that possible insight and instruction and inspiration that history has to offer.
Outstanding. Scott, thank
That's
you.
great.
Thank you very much for that. Folks, if you've got kids, you need to get them involved in Scott Powell history, but if you don't, or even if you do, you need to get yourself involved too. Take advantage of that opportunity. Thanks again, and we'll talk again. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.